I refuse to believe it's a coincidence that when I make a video analyzing a Candace Owens legal case, I then get bombarded with requests to cover the Tate brothers' extradition. If you're wondering what on earth I'm talking about, I made a video about Candace Owens and Andrew Tate 3 years ago. I'm not gonna link you to it because, them Andrew Tate followers and Candace Owens followers, actually. Anyways, before we talk about the extradition case, for me and my channel, the era of disclaimers is long dead. But considering the subject matter, being the Tate brothers, I do want to make a quick disclaimer. My opinion on the Tate brothers is completely irrelevant, okay? I don't matter. I'm a nobody, as many of you in the comments love to remind me every day. It's fine. I beat you to the chase. So don't try to insert political intent where I assure you there is none. The only commentary and judgment I have is so around a month ago, on the 19th of July, the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK released a press statement announcing that they have decided to prosecute the Tate brothers, who are UK citizens, they're dual citizens, US and UK, with additional offenses of a certain inappropriate nature. How on earth am I going to do this video with YouTube censoring every single thing we want to talk about? So previously in 2024, they had 21 charges pressed against them by the UK government, but they did say at the time that they would refrain from prosecuting them until the proceedings in Romania came to a conclusion, which they still haven't, which makes it all the more confusing as to why the UK decided to prosecute the Tate brothers anyway. 2 years later, the UK prosecution decided to tack on an additional 38 charges, bringing the total number to 59. And it's to do with offenses that are said to have taken place between July 2010 and August 2017. Some of them including minors. So obviously, incredibly serious stuff here. Not that any of the allegations against the Tate brothers have ever not been of a serious nature. These problems have been dogging them for years at this point. So in a nutshell, the UK is requesting the brothers' extradition. They are currently in Florida. That's where they were arrested. And the UK wants them to come and face the music, as it were. And the question on everyone's mind is, will this extradition ever come to fruition? I just rapped. I'm beginning to feel like a rapper. So I did a little bit of research, a little bit of reading, and by a little bit, I mean a lot. You better watch this video till the end. And there are three considerations, key considerations, that will be considered. I really should start scripting this stuff when deciding whether to grant an extradition request or accept it or not. This is really also bringing Julian Assange to mind, and I will touch upon his case because there are not necessarily parallels, but we can use his case as some kind of precedent to see what we can expect, even though Julian was, it was the other way around. It was the US requesting his extradition from the UK. But the three considerations are, first, there has to be an applicable treaty. Then the individual must be subject to that treaty, being the Tate brothers in this instance, and that probable cause or its rough equivalent exists to believe that the individual committed the offense or was sentenced as alleged. Basically, the standard of proof needs to be there. Without boring you too much, the treaty here does exist, obviously, and it is the extradition treaty between the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom, the same treaty that governed the Julian Assange extradition case. Now, in terms of what constitutes an extraditable offense, the treaty is quite flexible when it comes to that. It doesn't list the actual offenses that apply. Instead, it describes them or defines them as offenses that are punishable under the laws in both states by deprivation of liberty for a period of 1 year or more, or by a more severe penalty. Obviously, the incredibly serious sexual offenses that the Tate brothers are being accused of 100% meet that criteria. All right, so the administrative stuff ticked off. Statute of limitations, if you're curious, the time period during which these offenses can be prosecuted. does not exist in the UK when it comes to indictable offenses. So basically, even if the Tate brothers, here it's like 2010, which is literally 16 years ago, it doesn't matter. It's basically an unlimited time frame. The UK prosecution can choose to prosecute someone for something they did 50 years ago, as long as it's an indictable offense. All right, so what can the Tate brothers expect in their extradition hearing? What's the point of an extradition hearing? It's certainly not to try them for the offenses with which they have been charged. That's what's supposed to happen in the UK. That's why they're extraditing them or requesting the extradition in the first place. The main point of an extradition hearing is to determine whether, as I said, there's enough probable cause to grant the extradition. So it's not a matter of introducing evidence to prove or disprove the allegations, but rather to establish whether there is enough cause for the reasonable person, not many of those left out there, to conscientiously entertain a reasonable belief in the accused's guilt. So it's not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a much lower threshold. And what the UK has to do, or any requesting state, is introduce evidence to satisfy each element of the charges. Every crime has elements that must be ticked off. For instance, with first-degree murder, premeditation as an element must be ticked off. Of course, then you have, someone has to have been murdered, and the murder or loss of life must have been caused by the defendant. That's what constitutes the elements of a crime. The Tate brothers won't be able to defend themselves in this extradition hearing because, again, that's not the point. So if they want to bring up, defenses, literally anything like intoxication, for example, or temporary insanity, I don't know. That's not the forum for them to do that. They're going to have to wait to do that in the UK. That's not to say they won't be able to introduce any evidence at all, because what happens is in these hearings, the court distinguishes between explanatory evidence and contradictory evidence. Explanatory evidence is admissible if it clarifies or negates probable cause. But if they're introducing evidence just to contradict, just to disprove, to rebut the allegations altogether, wrong forum, inadmissible. Once probable cause has been established, the court must then determine whether any exceptions apply, exceptions that would prevent the brothers in this instance from being extradited. For example, if it would violate the defendant's human rights, if they were to be extradited. Julian Assange relied on this on appeal. In the first instance, his extradition was actually granted. And that's what I mean by his case is a really good one to use. It's so recent. It involves the same treaty, very different charges, of course, but the extradition was granted. There seems to be a pattern of favorability towards granting extraditions, by the way, just based on the research of the current landscape. Another really important exception, because the Tate brothers' lawyer is very heavily, not even hinting, literally saying out loud that this is a political persecution, not prosecution, but the brothers are being persecuted. This is a witch hunt of a political nature, and the UK is using the guise of these offenses. It's hiding behind these offenses in order to politically persecute them. Now, the reason he's bringing this up is because political offenses are actually an exception. So they would prevent extradition if the offenses are indeed found to be political in nature. While the treaty does make it clear that extradition shall not be granted if the offense is a political offense, it doesn't exactly define what a political offense is. Rather, it just details what isn't a political offense. Prima facie, just on the face of it, the nature of the accusations against the Tate brothers are not political offenses. Now they're arguing they're politically motivated, as I mentioned, which the treaty does touch upon. It says, regardless, extradition shall not be granted if the competent authority of the requested state, being the executive branch of the government, not the courts, the Secretary of State, determines that the request is politically motivated. So there is discretion. It's a gray area, and there's room to maneuver. At this point, the treaty ceases to be useful when it comes to determining what constitutes a political offense if it's not prima facie on its face obviously political, such as treason, for instance. Case law does help fill in the blanks. That is the point of case law, after all, whenever a statute or legislation is silent on a specific issue. So it's a two-pronged test. The first step is to determine whether the fugitive, the Tate brothers, were politically motivated to commit the offenses, and two, the offenses, when viewed objectively, were political in nature. What the US courts generally favor and tend to do is they distinguish between carrying out offenses against civilians and against military targets or government figures. Again, it's not a hard and fast rule, but generally, an assault against civilians, we're talking about civilians here, the alleged victims, I should say, innocent until proven guilty, everyone. That is one thing as a lawyer that I will stand by. But in this instance, the alleged victims are civilians. And so what the US courts tend to do is consider, well, that's not politically motivated. Again, just generally, it's up to the Tate brothers' counsel to argue otherwise. Then once all of these things are considered, the magistrate basically certifies whether Andrew and Tristan should be extradited. However, remember how I said the executive branch, the Secretary of State, is the one who will determine whether, for instance, the requesting party is politically motivated or not? It's actually up to the Secretary of State to determine the extradition. The final answer lies with, in this case, him. The court's role here is almost merely a recommendation that the Secretary of State can take into consideration when making his own determination. This is where things get interesting. People say the Tate brothers have been cozying up with the Republican Party, with Trump, and they're assuming that this is why, because they want friends in high places, because they know they're in trouble. Trouble seems to follow them all over the world, literally. And they wanted to make sure that they had people who could get them out of trouble, when trouble came knocking at their door. It remains to be seen whether this is an accurate analysis of the situation. Let me know what you think in the comments, though. Always happy to hear what you think or read. Generally speaking, the requesting party, the UK in this instance, has 60 days to formally file an extradition request, along with all the evidence that they have to back up their charges to establish probable cause. And in this instance, I believe the deadline is the 16th of September. So the Tate brothers have less than a month until this request is formally filed. They have another hearing scheduled for the 27th of August to determine whether they are at flight risk. Speaking of which, let's talk about that. Extradition cases are quite special in the sense that there is a presumption against bail in these cases. Courts operate on, the default position of, we're not going to grant you bail. In order to obtain bail, the defendants have to prove that they are not at flight risk and that they're not a danger to the community, or that special circumstances justify granting them bail. So the onus is on the defendant to prove that they deserve to be let out on bail. The UK is actively fighting this. This was actually meant to be heard on Thursday, but the Tate's lawyers filed a request to just stay the hearing until the 27th of August because they needed more time. Whatever happens, either side can actually appeal that ruling as well. So if the Tate brothers get denied bail, they can appeal it. If they get granted bail, the prosecution can appeal it too. And of course, that's just going to drag things out, which is actually the current strategy for the defense. The Tate lawyers have announced that the Tates are challenging the extradition. So they're not going to go without a fight, basically. And what this means is that this is going to drag on for months. Not sure if it's going to take years, like with Julian Assange, but definitely months. speaking of appeals, and we just talked about the bail hearing appeal, can the Tate brothers appeal the extradition decision? That is, after all, what Julian Assange successfully did. Now, I say he was successful. So the extradition was granted. He successfully was granted permission to appeal. But then before that even went ahead, the US basically was like, hey, we're going to give you this plea deal. We're just going to charge you or convict you of one offense in the Espionage Act instead of 17. And you get to walk free because you've basically already served the prison term effectively. And he accepted it, which tells me the US wasn't confident that they would be granted the extradition on appeal. The major concern, though, with Julian Assange was the death penalty, because the crimes he was charged with under the Espionage Act were capital offenses. And his team was arguing, we need assurances that you will not subject him to the death penalty. We need assurances that he won't be, for example, put in solitary confinement because he is at major suicide risk. The man was imprisoned for years. His situation was incredibly different to the Tate brothers. The Tate brothers have it easy in comparison to what Julian Assange went through. And so there were significant human rights concerns that the US was probably quite worried about in terms of whether it would block the extradition. The Tate brothers don't really have any of these concerns. And so their grounds of appeal in the US are quite limited and is really restricted to reviewing whether the magistrate had jurisdiction, whether the offense charged is within the treaty, and whether there was any evidence supporting probable cause. Generally, if there is enough evidence, then the original decision is upheld. As far as I'm aware, there are basically zero human rights concerns specifically regarding the extradition. I know the Tate brothers are in solitary confinement right now for their own protection, but that's in the US. Their team can obviously argue it. It's their job, in fact, to argue it and to try everything they can. But whether it's going to succeed is an entirely different story. All in all, this seems to be an uphill battle for the defense, for the Tate brothers. As I've mentioned, the main focus here is whether the UK has enough grounds to request the extradition, rather than testing the case in terms of its merits. The merits of the case are to be tested in the UK during trial. The only hope they have really is friends in high places. If the Secretary of State, why is that so hard for me to say, decides, you know what, no, I think this is politically motivated, or for any other reason, unbeknownst to me at this point, he can block it. That's all I have for you today. I hope I explained the process. Obviously, I can't tell you what's going to happen because we don't know. Gray area. I suppose that's the key feature that makes this case so interesting, other than obviously the notoriety of the defendants, the Tate brothers. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think this is a politically motivated persecution/prosecution? Or have you seen enough throughout the years to determine that there is at least probable cause for them to go and face justice? They could be found innocent. They could be acquitted, I should say. Because beyond a reasonable doubt, very high burden. I've seen stuff on social media over the years, I'm not gonna lie, but we don't know what evidence the UK prosecution, the CPS, has at this point. Whatever they have is likely a lot stronger than whatever we, as the public, have seen on social media. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, let me know what you think. Political persecution or genuine prosecution? Vote yay or nay in the comment section. And I'll see you in the next one.